Hi, I'm Rabbi Jeremy Kreidel from Mahar, the Washington Congregation for Secular Humanistic Judaism here in the Washington, D.C. area. And this is the third of 4 videos for late July 2020 on the Torah portions that are read as part of the regular traditional reading cycle during this past month. We've already talked about Chukat and Balak as a joint Torah portion and Parshat Pinchas. We're now turning to Matot and Maaseh. Matot and Maaseh are the last two, now they're joined as a joint portion, Parshiot in the Book of Numbers. So Matot Maaseh is a joint Torah portion because we're in a non-leap year on the Jewish calendar, which means that we have one less month to work with, so Torah portions get combined a little bit. And Matot Maaseh is one of the pairs of portions that can be joined. So Matot is going to give us some really interesting narratives to talk about. It's going to give us some really worrying laws to think about. And it opens with laws about oaths. And it becomes very clear that the oaths that it's worried about are very specific, or is a very specific one, and is the oath and the procedure surrounding something called sotah. Sotah is understood to be the status of a woman whose husband believes but can't prove that she has committed adultery. Right? There are all kinds of aspects of proof in Israelite and in Jewish law for proving that somebody has engaged in illicit sexual intercourse. There need to be witnesses and all kinds of other things. And this is a situation where the husband can't prove it, can't meet the evidentiary standard. And so we get this ritual that is an awful lot, in some ways, like the ritual of the red heifer that we actually talked about at the beginning of our discussion of Parshat Chukat. We have a scroll. The scroll is burned and mixed into water. The woman is instructed to give an oath that says that I know what will happen if I committed adultery, and I'm not giving you the exact words, I'm giving you the gist. And the idea is she drinks this water that's mixed in with a burned scroll. If she has committed adultery, it says that her thigh and belly will sag. It's not clear what this means. Does it mean that she'll have a miscarriage? Maybe. Thigh sometimes refers to genitalia in the Hebrew Bible. It's not clear if she'll suffer some kind of physical deformity that will then be a physical mark that she has committed adultery. The rabbis even speculate that maybe that's a thing that happens, and also she becomes infertile as a result, and that's the punishment. However, if she is found not to have committed adultery, she drinks this water and nothing bad happens, she'll become pregnant by her husband. That's the reward. Query whether that's a reward for somebody whose husband is paranoid enough to think that they committed adultery and drag her to the priests to make a ritual happen about that. That's more problematic, but that is what the Sotah ritual is about in any event. We then get the story of the Israelites going to war against Midian and defeating the Midianites. And we also learn here that a character from a couple of Torah portions ago, Bil'am ben Beor, Bil'am son of Beor, who is a prophet that we know of at least stories about in other ancient Near Eastern literature. One of the few times that we get one of these folks show up in other ancient Near Eastern literature that we've had in the Torah. We are told that among the people killed by the Israelites in this kind of total war that they tend to wage is Bil'am. So we now know that what we are told what happens to Bil'am, and we then get a rather long description of how the spoils of war are portioned out. But not before we find Moses rebuking the officers of the Israelite army. And he rebukes them because they don't kill enough women. Specifically, he doesn't think they killed enough women who were of an age to have given birth to children. And we are told that he orders a number more women killed. So this is not a pleasant part of the biblical narrative, and this brings up that the Torah has laws of war. And the laws of war that the Torah has are, when it comes to certain non-Israelite peoples, absolutely brutal and involve killing almost everybody and destroying almost everything. This is not one of those particular wars, but it is of comparable violence. And we need to be aware that when we think about the Tanakh and we think about core values of Judaism, core values of Christianity as centering on peace, there's a lot in the traditions that is not so peaceful, and that we really need to take seriously the extent to which we're projecting our own expectations on tradition. So we get a large discussion of who gets what as spoils of war, and we then get a story that's important in the broader scheme of the biblical text about how the tribes are going to be apportioned out. And what we get is the tribes of Reuven and Gad approaching Moses and saying, Moses, we don't want to cross over the river. So by this point, the Israelites have actually gotten all the way around. They've come through the Sinai Peninsula, according to the text of the Torah. They've gone through the Sinai Peninsula, they've come up and around and are really on the verge of crossing into the land of Canaan. And Reuven and Gad have surveyed the land that they're in, and that was part of Midian, and they come to Moses and say, we don't want to leave. We would like to settle here and not in the land. This is, in the biblical narrative, this is pretty bad. This is, we've come all of this way. The entire point of this is to give you land in the place that was promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and your ancestors, and now you don't want it? And there's an added problem, and the added problem is this. If you stay here, and we have to wage war over there, what do we do about the fact that we're missing about 40,000 soldiers? And the answer becomes, we will leave our livestock, we will leave our children, we will leave our wives here, and we will actually be the first in line to fight the wars to take the land of Canaan. And that resolves the conflict. But it's important because it's going to show that as we proceed down the line in Israelite politics, according to the stories that come after the Torah that we get in the prophetic books, in the former prophets, so the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, particularly in the book of Judges, we discover that these Israelite tribes are barely even a confederacy most of the time. They fight with each other. They actively go to war with each other. And here are two of them on the other side of the river. This is, as you can see, this is setting up Israelite tribes for a lot of conflict, to say nothing of the fact that they're now in what had been Midian. This is where Reuven and this is where Reuven and Gad are, according to the Torah, going to settle down, is on the other side of the river from everybody else. They're going to have different concerns. They're going to have different economic interests. They're going to have different socio-political interests. They're going to have different religious interests. And this is setting up for the conflicts that are going to come, particularly in the book of Judges. So that's the Matot half of Matot Maseh. Maseh, the second half, is a recap of our journey. We're getting Numbers coming toward its end, and so we're getting kind of a recap of everything that's happened since the Exodus from Egypt, This is not the first time it's happened in the Tanakh. It will not be the last time it happens. In fact, the book of Deuteronomy opens with the story till now, attributed to Moses. So we get a recap of the story that we've had in the book of Numbers in particular, and we get discussion of entering the land of Canaan. We get the boundaries of Israel. So this is the first time, maybe not the first time, but it is a significant point, because this is now, we know, according to the text of the Torah, which people who are familiar with real estate and real estate law know that there's a thing called a legal description of land, which is actually very precise about the size of a parcel of land. The Torah is not so precise, but it is going to say from the Jordan to the sea, and from here to there, from here in the south to there in the north, right? We get this set of boundaries from the text of the Torah, and we get it at this point. We get it in Parshat Maseh. We get the leadership of the people passing from Moses to Joshua. We've already had the passing of the priestly leadership go from Aaron to his son Eleazar, but we're getting a little bit of recap of that happening too. We're getting stories about cities dedicated to Levites, not really stories, but legal texts. We're getting discussion of the idea that there will be cities set aside in the land for the Levites, because Levites can't own land and they can't own and pass down property. They're not getting a share in the land of Israel. They rely upon other people's donations to function and to live. There are cities that will be dedicated to the Levites. They won't really own them exactly, but the important part is that people can't buy into them from outside the Levitical tribes. So this is an important point. This is kind of stability in housing and the ability to farm. We also get discussion of cities of refuge. So cities of refuge is the idea that sometimes people commit homicide and they didn't really mean to. And this seems to be the recognition on the part of the book of Numbers that sometimes when you do that, the people that you live with aren't real happy, and they might respond violently to you as a murderer, and you need a way to not have to stay. You might not want to rely upon the justice of your neighbors, right? So the idea is we have these cities of refuge where these people have committed unintentional, what some commentators call unintentional murder. They need a place to go, and these cities of refuge are a place where they can go. People who have intentionally committed murder don't get to go there. They are going to have to undergo Israelite justice, which usually involves being stoned at the gates of the town or otherwise executed. But the people who have committed unintentional murder, there's a recognition that the intent here is different, and we can't have them stay, but we can't really impose the same justice, so they get refugee cities to go to. This does not mean, by the way, that the Torah or that Judaism subsequent to it is definitely anti-death penalty. Again, we shouldn't read ourselves into the text. But it is an indication that there's some level of recognition that there are consequences to action and there are intents behind the actions, and you sometimes have to distinguish between those in imposing punishment and in understanding and governing people's actions. So that's the idea behind the cities of refuge. And there's a distinction made between murder and manslaughter. And then one of the last episodes we get in the book of Numbers before Numbers closes, and it's really the last narrative, that real narrative that we get, is the second half of the story of the daughters of Zelophehad. So we talked about the daughters of Zelophehad a little while ago, right? We talked about them in Parshat Pinchas. We're now wrapping up their story. And their story here goes something like this. They've inherited property, and the elders of their tribe, the elders of Manasseh, come forward to Moses and say, absolutely not. This can't stand, because they could marry out of the tribe. Never mind that we already know from the narrative that the daughters of Zelophehad have agreed to marry within the tribe. The elders of the tribe come to Moses and say, this can't stand. They'll marry outside the tribe. We don't want tribal inheritances whittled down, especially because, remember, right now, we've already had in Parshat Matot, we've had Reuven and Gad say, we want to stay here. What happens if they marry into Reuven and Gad and they're not anywhere near the tribe of Manasseh's apportioned lands? So this is a significant point for a broader idea of how property inheritance and the integrity of tribal lands would go. And so we get Moses instructing the daughters of Zelophehad to do what they've already said they would do, which is to marry within the tribe of Manasseh. And then we get some wrap-up language, and that's it for the book of Numbers. And we are going to move into the book of Deuteronomy with our next video, with the first portion of Deuteronomy, the first Parsha, which is Parshat Devarim. Devarim just means words. So, Elu Devarim, these are the words. These are the words of Moses. That's where we're stopping off next.